Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Lifelong Learning Lecture. We are pleased to have with us again Dr. David Smailes, Associate Professor of Political Science at FSU. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about the 2024 presidential election so far. A few notes before we get into tonight. That is, if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones. We appreciate that. We welcome any feedback you have about tonight's lecture. So you'll see at the back of the room some evaluation forms, and we welcome any feedback you have about tonight's lecture, as well as any topic ideas you have for future lectures. And speaking of future lectures, we ask that you join us on March 7th for our next Lifelong Learning Lecture, Temples in My Mind, Charles Dickens and His Illustrators, with Dr. Helen Heineman. And please note that that lecture will be a Zoom-only lecture. There'll be nothing held, no meeting held here in the Costin room, and there'll be no live streaming to YouTube either. A video recording will go up following the Zoom lecture once it's done. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. David Smailes. Thank you.
How all this works first. I thought that might not be a bad idea. For those of you who are political junkies, you may know a lot of this already, but for the folks who are a little less familiar maybe with how this process works, I think it'd be a good idea to have that background as we talk about what's been happening so far in the presidential election. And believe it or not, we are really still in the early stages of all this, even though it seems like it's been going on for a long time. It is still early. And so I'll invite all of you to offer any questions, any comments you have towards the end. Let me do a quick presentation, and then I'll try to save some time at the end for your thoughts on all this as well. And so let's begin with really the kind of structure that we're talking about with how all this works. Let me get my clicker going here. Excuse me just a minute. There we go. Oh, doesn't seem to be working. Hold on just a second, folks. All right, we'll do it this way. Oops. So we're talking about a system of elections that are part of what we call the nomination stage of this process. Right now, the two parties, of course, are settling on who their candidate is going to be for the fall general elections. So we go through this process every 4 years. This year, as it turns out, of course, we have an incumbent president, President Biden, who has had challengers, but challengers who have not really gained much ground. And so, in effect, he is the Democratic nominee this time around. So, of course, our focus is really on the Republican Party this time as a result. What happens basically is each political party determines early on how many people they want to have attend their conventions that will take place this summer. And by determining that number, and a very complicated formula they use to decide where support has come from in the past, they allocate delegates to the different states. And each state then has an election, either a primary or a caucus, to determine who those delegates are going to go and vote for at the convention. And a majority of the delegates is what gets you the nomination. When you've got a majority of the delegates lined up, you are the nominee in effect of the party. So even though the conventions won't be held until later this summer, we'll know, and I'm going to suggest to you fairly soon, who the nominee of the Republican Party is likely to be out of this process. The way that these work in primaries is that we hold elections, and of course we've got one coming up on March 5th here in Massachusetts. States have either what are called open or closed primaries. In an open primary, anyone can walk in who's a registered voter and tell the people at the voting place which party they want to vote in, which caucus or primary they want to vote in for which party. So if I'm a Democrat or an independent and it's an open primary, I can walk in and ask for a Republican ballot and vote as a Republican, essentially as a Republican voter. Closed primaries, you have to be a declared member of the political party. And that means that you have to register in advance in order to participate in that particular kind of primary. We also have what are called winner-take-all primaries. These are primaries where the person who wins the most votes gets all of the delegates from that particular state. So winner-take-all primaries put delegates into someone's category very quickly. Proportional primaries, the third one on the list, is where the delegates are allocated by the percentage of the vote. So if you win 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the delegates that have been allocated to that state. Now, the Democrats run their primaries entirely proportionally. So whenever they have primaries, and again, this time around we're not seeing it, but whenever they have primaries, the percentage of the vote determines how many delegates they get out of a particular state. The Republicans do winner-take-all primaries in some states. They do proportional primaries in some states, and they do what's called a hybrid form of primary. And in that sort of election, up until a certain point, they allocate things proportionally, but if any candidate gets more than 50% of the vote in that state, they get all the delegates from that state. In effect, it's a winner-take-all state at that point. And of course, right now, we have essentially two candidates, right, running for the Republican nomination, Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. One of them is bound to get 50% of the vote in these states. So all the hybrid states are, in effect, winner-take-all states this time around. And that's a pretty significant factor in all this because, again, it's very easy to get a lot of delegates very quickly in winner-take-all states. We do have states that run things by caucuses. That's a very different kind of election. Rather than walking into a voting booth and marking a ballot, you actually physically show up at a particular location to register your support for a candidate. These are done in public places, a local school gymnasium sometimes, or a YMCA or wherever. And people actually go and they move to a part of the room to be counted because they're supporting a particular candidate. So caucuses are very much driven by turnout, who shows up, and caucuses are much more informal than other kinds of elections. So caucuses tend to be a little less representative of the people in a particular state, and actually we have fewer and fewer caucuses each presidential election time. The states are moving away from them for the most part. The Constitution says nothing about any of this, by the way. Nothing in the Constitution about how you pick candidates for political parties. And in the early days, the expectation was that candidates would emerge almost naturally based on what they referred to as the national reputation of particular candidates. And it's no surprise, if you ever had to memorize the presidents, I had to do that in elementary school, the first ones are pretty easy, right? Because they're the Revolutionary War guys who had Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These were people who had this kind of reputation, and so they naturally were the kind of people that recommended themselves as presidential candidates. And so political parties didn't exist for part of this time, and when they did, it wasn't the party making this decision, it was actually the electors themselves on election day deciding who they thought should be a candidate. Now, for a brief time, Congress actually ran this process. They called it the King Caucus when Congress did it, but right around the 1840s, we started to have political conventions get created. But what's different about these early conventions, in fact, most of our political history, is that these conventions were really controlled by the party bosses, the people who were running the political party in these different major cities and towns around America. And most of the people who came to these conventions to deliberate on who the candidate was going to be were also party leaders. So the average voter had no say in who their political party nominee was going to be. And in fact, most of the time, the people who really made this decision were the big bosses from the big cities who would gather in a back room someplace, light up their cigars, and sit there and talk about who their candidate should be for that particular presidential election. From which we actually get two phrases in politics. The smoke-filled room that people refer to all the time as the place where the real decisions are being made comes from this period. And the other phrase is dark horse candidates, because often these party bosses would pick people that most people had never even heard of necessarily. But because they thought the person would be a safe candidate that would follow the lead of the party and the instructions of the party, those were the people they tended to give the nod to. So what we're talking about tonight, primaries and caucuses, really came about at the turn of the last century with what was known as the progressive movement. and a series of politicians who, sorry, this sort of jumped ahead on me, the series of politicians who advocated for the people, the average voter, having more of a say in who the party nominee should be. And so one of the things they invented, essentially, was the presidential primary. Now, early on in all this, when the primaries were first started, again, right around the beginning of the 1900s, there were only a handful of them. There were only about 7 or 8 the first time around. Today, of course, all the states have primaries or caucuses in this process. And for many, many years, many presidential election cycles, that number stayed relatively small. By 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt became the nominee of the Democratic Party, there were only about 15 primaries around the country. Primaries weren't used very much to determine who the candidate was going to be. This was still a matter for the party leaders and the party bosses to decide at these conventions. In fact, primaries kind of had a bad image. You entered a primary, but since there were so few of them, and since so few people turned out, most of the time primaries were kind of seen as the place where losers go to try to get support. You went to and competed in a primary to demonstrate you had some support in the party from the average voter. But because there were so few and so few people turned out, it didn't have much influence when it came to the actual choosing of a political candidate. So even though we had primaries, they didn't do what we're used to talking about them doing, determining who ultimately the presidential nominee is going to be for a political party. That began to change when candidates realized how they could use primaries, though. And I think the person to point to in that direction is John Kennedy. In 1960, Kennedy had a problem. Many Democrats did not think a Catholic could win the presidency. And he had to demonstrate in some way that voters, particularly Protestant voters, would turn out to vote for a Catholic candidate. So he entered the West Virginia primary with the specific goal of demonstrating that a state that is roughly, at the time, 98% Protestant would actually choose a Catholic candidate in their primary. And he worked that state, spent a lot of money in that state, spent a lot of time in that state in order to be able to demonstrate that. So if anything, primaries gave candidates an opportunity to show support in some way. Eisenhower called them the national beauty contest when he referred to it in 1952. But it did serve a kind of political purpose. Now, all this changed in 1968. In 1968, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago. You might remember the riot that happened in Grant Park, right? The clash with the police and so on. Lyndon Johnson had decided to decline being the candidate in 1968, announced at an end of a speech on Vietnam that he was not going to be the nominee of the party. He did that because he was challenged in the New Hampshire primary by Gene McCarthy, Senator Gene McCarthy. Now, McCarthy didn't win that primary, but he took enough votes away from Johnson that he demonstrated Johnson's vulnerability as a presidential candidate, and it led to Johnson making the decision to drop out. How did McCarthy do it? Well, he rallied a lot of younger people, younger voters in particular, who were against the Vietnam War and opposed Lyndon Johnson's policy in the Vietnam War. I'm going to try to go back here. Sorry. I don't think I can. Oh, rats. Sorry about that. I jumped ahead too far. I wanted to show you the picture of a young McCarthy supporter getting his hair cut and getting his beard shaved. They did this to try to demonstrate that they, just trying to get this to work, sorry, that in fact they could go out and campaign for Gene McCarthy and do relatively well in drawing voters to Gene McCarthy. They called it getting clean for Gene when they cut their hair and they shaved their beards off and so on. Well, again, the Democratic Party in that time, in 1968, still mostly dominated and controlled by party bosses. They turned to Vice President Hubert Humphrey as their nominee. Most Democrats who were against the war, of course, associated Hubert Humphrey, of course, with Lyndon Johnson and Johnson's policies. And even though Humphrey had some major disagreements with Johnson on Vietnam, that's not the way most people perceived Hubert Humphrey. They saw him as an extension of Lyndon Johnson, the ventriloquist dummy sitting on the lap of the president, spouting off all these supportive things about Lyndon Johnson. Well, what that meant was in 1968, the Democrats went through a kind of crisis of conscience. They realized that this process wasn't working anymore, that it really wasn't demonstrating or reflecting the views of average Democratic voters and who their nominee should be. So they formed a commission in 1968 to look into this and decide to have a new set of rules for their 1972 Democratic Convention. This commission was headed up by George McGovern, who was a senator from South Dakota at the time. And the McGovern Commission said what we need to do is turn this power over to the average rank and file Democrats. We need to elect people to come to these conventions who are not party leaders, but simply Democratic voters who are interested and concerned about who the nominee should be, and allow them to make this decision. And so the Democrats changed their rules. They made it more representative of the party. They guaranteed that the delegates would be representative of the average Democratic voter in that way. Maybe not a surprise, in 1972, the candidate they picked was George McGovern, as it turns out, the head of this commission. But it was the first opportunity for the voters in the Democratic Party to really have a say in who their nominee was going to be. And of course, it was the fact that average Democrats now were making that decision that allowed people like Jimmy Carter in 1976 to emerge as a candidate, relatively unknown to most of the party leaders, not a national figure by any means, but became, in essence, the people's candidate, right, Jimmy Who, and in the end ended up with the Democratic nomination, much to the surprise of people like Henry Jackson and Hubert Humphrey and some of the more traditional mainstream Democratic candidates who would have been probably more of a pick for the party leaders. So beginning with these primaries now, we have a system where we hold these primaries, and these primaries determine delegates who ultimately add up until someone gets a majority of the delegates and therefore is guaranteed the nomination when the convention actually happens. Now, what I have up here is a series of maps because I want to show you what's been happening around these primaries and caucuses. Beginning back all the way back in 1976, which you see in the upper left-hand corner up there, and stretching all the way down to 2008 in the lower right-hand corner down here, you see maps that represent the calendar of the days on which primaries are scheduled. And if you notice, the very, very dark blue, the darkest blue, are primaries and caucuses that are held in January. And if you look up there at 1976, there's only a few that were held early on. Take a look at the map down here at 2008, and you can see there were many more that happened in January. Even more so, February, the next darkest category, right? In 1976, just a handful of primaries and caucuses in February. In 2008, nearly the entire country had their they had their primaries and caucuses in February. What they've been doing, in other words, the parties, they've been moving their schedule of primaries and caucuses up earlier and earlier on the calendar. We call it front loading in politics. And the idea is a simple one. If we have more primaries and caucuses early, we'll have more delegates elected quickly, we'll settle on who our nominee is going to be quickly, and then they can start running against the other party. So the faster we make this decision, the better. That way we get it done, we move on to focusing on the general election. It seemed like a good theory, and as I say, election after election, the parties continued to move further and further towards this idea of front-loading until 2008. And in 2008, of course, John McCain became the nominee of the Republican Party, Barack Obama the nominee of the Democratic Party. Now, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were following this schedule too, right? There was no incumbent running for re-election in 2008. So both parties were competing along this schedule. There wasn't a whole lot of difference between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton on a lot of issues in 2008. So their process turned out to be a very long, drawn-out one in 2008. Even though we had all these primaries kind of crammed at the beginning of the schedule, they really had very close primary results in most of the primaries and caucuses. I remember telling my students it was kind of boring to watch their debates during this time because they pretty much agreed on everything. It kept being, well, I agree with Hillary, I agree with Barack, I agree with Hillary. It wasn't all that exciting. John McCain, on the other hand, was a person that emerged very quickly as a candidate. He didn't do too well at first, but these were all the primaries that were held in January in 2008. And by the time he got around to South Carolina and particularly Florida, he started to pick up momentum. And then, because of front loading and all these early primaries and caucuses, came a major event on February 5th. 21 states held their primaries and caucuses on the same day, on that date. I have the date right, don't I? February 5th. Sorry, am I looking at it right? I don't have my glasses on, so I can't quite tell. Yeah. 21 states, a lot of delegates, all on one day being decided. And John McCain nailed down the nomination on that day. The next day, the only other competitive Republican at that point, Mitt Romney, dropped out of the race. He got up in front of cameras and said, that's it. He's our nominee. And following that, we call it Super Tuesday because there were so many delegates all decided at the same time. The only problem was a lot of Republicans didn't like John McCain that much, particularly social conservatives. McCain talked a lot about cutting government and reducing taxes and so on, but he didn't talk about abortion, he didn't talk about gun control, he didn't talk about prayer in the schools, the kind of issues that a lot of social conservatives are really concerned about. So they didn't see him as one of their own. They kind of felt like he was pushed on them by the schedule. And so he had a hard time. He had a hard time uniting his support in the Republican Party. He had a hard time getting these folks to turn out to vote in 2008. It's one of the reasons Barack Obama won this election, is that so few Republicans really were motivated to turn out to vote for John McCain. So the Republicans realized they had a problem. This front loading was getting to the point where the party really wasn't having an opportunity to look at these candidates and make a decision over time. And so they decided to change the rules. Now in 2012, Barack Obama's running for re-election, right? So this doesn't affect him or the Democrats in 2012. He has the nomination by a walk. No one's challenging him, which by the way meant he could save a lot of money that he would have had to spend, right, in a primary contest. But on the Republican side, there were a number of candidates that emerged. Mitt Romney, very early on, everyone said is the front runner, but you might remember Rick Santorum emerged as a very strong opponent to Mitt Romney. Newt Gingrich was in this race for a long period of time as an opponent to Mitt Romney. One of the reasons they got the opportunity to stay in so long is because the Republicans decided to reverse front loading. We're going to push everything back. We're going to slow this process down. So they cut down on the number of primaries that were held in January, first of all, cut them in half, and waited until March, a whole month later than they did in 2008, to hold their Super Tuesday. And on that Super Tuesday, on March 6th, they only had 10 states that held their primaries and caucuses, not 21. So there was a long period of time that gave these other candidates a chance to raise money, get some press attention, begin to find their own base within the party, and that led to a long, drawn-out fight for Mitt Romney to become the nominee. And in fact, it wasn't until much later in the calendar, May and June, in fact, when South Dakota, New Mexico, and in particular Texas and California, which had had their primaries very early the last time around, two very big states with a lot of delegates at stake, were not coming in until the very end of this process as part of deciding who the nominee was going to be. So while Barack Obama had a cakewalk to become the nominee of the party, Mitt Romney had this long, drawn-out fight. And by the time he got done with that fight, by the end of all this, he had spent a lot of money trying to nail down the nomination, a lot of time on the road. He was exhausted as a candidate, his coffers were almost empty, and Barack Obama was sitting on literally millions of dollars ready to spend on the general election campaign. Again, it gave a huge advantage to Barack Obama for that reason. So the Republicans reversed course again. And now, of course, the Democrats are in the mix because the Democrats now have to decide on a candidate too. And in 2016, they walked some of this back. They tried to find a middle ground between front loading in 2008 and this long stretched out process in 2012. And what they came up with in 2016 was a calendar that still pushed things back. No primaries or caucuses in January this time around. Only a handful again in February, a fairly limited number in February. And then a Super Tuesday in March that consisted, as you can see up there, of 11 states on March 1st. And then a little bit later, about a week later, a second Super Tuesday that everybody called Little Super Tuesday, which was 8 more primaries on that date. So not as stretched out as 2012, but at the same time not front-loaded the way that 2008 was. And that balance seemed to work. And it gave, again, both parties time to have the fights that they had to determine who their nominee was going to be, whether it was Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders or whether or not it was the Republicans led by Donald Trump in the end. It took Trump a while to gather that kind of support, by the way. A lot of Republicans weren't sure of Trump at the beginning, and what Trump tended to do, pollsters tell us, is pick up a lot of Republicans as everybody's second choice in that nomination process. As candidates dropped out, remember Jeb Bush was the guy everybody was saying was going to be the nominee that year, remember? As he dropped out, as others dropped out of the race, the voters tended to drift towards Donald Trump as a second choice. And because, as we're going to see in a minute, many of these primaries were primaries that were winner take all primaries, it meant that he could get a lot of delegates very quickly as this process went on. So that was the deal that seemed to work best, and it continued into 2020. The Democrats, of course, in 2020 were the focus this time, right? Donald Trump is the given nominee of the Republican Party. You might remember the South Carolina primary, roughly 4th in the list, was the primary that Joe Biden ended up winning by a very large margin, in part thanks to, or in a major sort of way, thanks to Jim Clyburn, who's a very influential representative in South Carolina Democratic politics. But Biden didn't do well at first. And you might remember, people were counting Biden out in the first couple contests, right? He didn't do well in Iowa. He didn't compete in New Hampshire. He spent a day in New Hampshire and then left to go to South Carolina. All his bets were on South Carolina, and it paid off. This big victory in South Carolina pushed out many of these other candidates who were in the race. Bernie Sanders was the only one left. By the time they got to Super Tuesday on March 3rd, Biden ends up winning most of the Super Tuesday states on March 3rd. And the 4 that Bernie Sanders wins, Biden came in a very close second. So, for example, Bernie Sanders won California in 2020, but Biden came in just a few percentage points behind Bernie Sanders in the voting, which meant he proportionally got a pretty big chunk of delegates out of California. So in the Democratic contest, you don't necessarily have to win a primary. All you have to do is come in a close second, and you're going to pick up a large number of delegates. That's what Biden did in the states that he lost to Bernie Sanders. Sanders didn't do as well in some of the states that he lost to Biden. And then with the last remaining primaries, Biden won all of them except for 2 and ends up becoming the nominee of the party. And of course, with the virus going on, that was a very awkward time. Remember, the way in which campaigning took place and the difficulty of holding debates and so on, all shaped to some degree the outcome in 2020. So here we are, 2024, right? The primary schedule in 2024 looks something like this. We've already had the New Hampshire and Iowa contests in this race. February is the month in which other contests are taking place. The Democrats had their South Carolina primary at the beginning of this month. The Republicans have theirs this Saturday, right? And that's the one that's in the news right now quite a bit. Following that is going to be contests in Nevada and Michigan, which are going to come a short period of time later. Michigan is next Tuesday, in fact, on the 27th. No, sorry, Nevada already happened. Michigan is coming up on the 27th. And then March 5th is the Super Tuesday this time around. And we're in with all these other states that are listed for Super Tuesday. I think there are roughly 14 of those states holding their primaries all on the same day. And you can see there, California, Texas, North Carolina, a number of states with a large number of delegates at stake. Followed very shortly after that by Wisconsin and Georgia in particular in this next batch a week later. And then a short time after that, a week later, and again, I should have had my glasses on here, Arizona, Ohio, Kansas, Illinois, enough big states with enough delegates at stake that will be a significant day as well. My prediction, if I'm going to make predictions, is that if not before March 19th, this is all going to be done. We're going to have a nominee by March 19th, excuse me. And let me explain why. We've got Iowa, right, and the Iowa results. I'm going to get my glasses out. I'm reaching that age where I need my glasses. I'm sorry to say. We have the results in Iowa, which Donald Trump won rather handily, but Nikki Haley, again, and Ron DeSantis picked up delegates in Iowa, again, because of this proportional representation in Iowa. And of course, New Hampshire, Donald Trump again won the New Hampshire primary, but Nikki Haley came in a pretty respectable second place in New Hampshire, and again, picked up delegates because of that, because both of these states are proportional states in these Republican contests. So even though Nikki Haley lost those two primaries, or the primary and the caucus, I should say, she did pretty well. And certainly when Ron DeSantis dropped out in New Hampshire, demonstrated some real support in the party. So it's not entirely clear, as the Republican National Committee has been trying to say, that everybody's ready to line up behind Donald Trump. I think that's an exaggeration. And certainly, given the results of these two contests, as well as what happened in Nevada, Donald Trump has 63 delegates at this point in his column pledged to vote for him at the convention in the summer. Nikki Haley has 17 delegates so far in this contest. But it takes 1,215 delegates to have a majority of the total number of delegates that are going to be attending the Republican convention. We are far away from knowing who this nominee is going to be at this point. It is, I think, an exaggeration on the part of the Republican committee to say it's clearly going to be Donald Trump at this point. It's not clear. There are a lot of contests to come in this election, and there are a lot of primaries and caucuses that could easily change the balance between these two candidates. Now, we don't know if they will. So far, Donald Trump, as I'm going to show you in a minute, is ahead in a number of polls in these contests. It's a long shot, a struggle for Nikki Haley, but I don't think people should be counting her out just yet. We're really early on in this process, very early on in this process. And if you go back to what I showed you a minute ago, let me just change this a bit and show you something else. I put a little key down here at the bottom. Those states that you see in the red that are coming up are winner-take-all primaries. And as you can see, Colorado on March 5th is a winner-take-all primary. Arizona, Florida, and Ohio are all winner-take primaries that are going to be coming up. They're going to come on the 19th, so there's a lot of delegates at stake on the 19th that whoever wins the most votes in those states are going to walk away with all of those delegates. And the purple states that you see up there are the hybrid states. Now, because we only have two candidates in this race, someone is bound to win 50% of the vote in those states. So in effect, these are also winner-take-all states this time around. If there were 3 or 4 other competitive candidates in this race, it might be possible that enough votes would be drawn away from whoever is the front runner that someone might not get 50%, and then the delegates would be allocated proportionally. But because it's only Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, one or the other is going to end up with 50% of the vote in those states. So every purple state that you see up there is in effect a winner-take-all state this time around. That means Michigan, that's coming up next week, California, Arkansas, Texas, thinking of the big ones here, Georgia, right, and the following week on March 12th. Those are all states where someone will pick up a tremendous number of delegates on that day. A large number of delegates at stake. And again, all it's going to take is 50% or more of the vote in order to do that. So it's fairly clear that March 5th is going to be a big day in determining who the nominee is going to be. Now, I'll show you in just a minute, it's not enough to guarantee it for anyone, but it's certainly going to be a big day in deciding this race. One other wrinkle to throw in here in all of this is that the states that are in italics are the states that are closed primaries. You must be a registered Republican to vote in the primary in those states. And you notice some of the bigger states on this list are also closed primary states. In particular, states like Massachusetts, we're technically a closed primary state, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma. Some of these states are going to be states where it's not going to be possible for independents or Democrats to be a part of this process. And in those states, at least what we've seen so far in this race, in those states, that's likely to give Donald Trump an advantage. because some of Nikki Haley's support has been coming from independent voters or Democrats who have been participating in open primary states. So not only is the fact that many of these states are going to be winner-take-all states likely to be in favor of Donald Trump, because right now he's leading in a lot of these states in polls, also the fact that a number of these states are closed primary states means that he's also got an advantage there. All those things are working in his favor. This is why a lot of people are looking at what's coming and saying, it pretty much seems like Donald Trump's going to win this thing. And to some degree, that's probably true, given the rules and the structure of the way these our elections are going to go. But we all know, I think, it's not an exaggeration to say anything can happen with Donald Trump, right? There's been a lot of surprises with Donald Trump in the past couple months. We've got a lot of things going on in this election. Who knows where we'll be on March 5th with a lot of what's happening around Donald Trump. We just don't know how events are maybe going to shape some of this. Is there going to be something that leads voters to turn away from Donald Trump? Is there something that it's going to make Republicans who are not solid Donald Trump supporters change their mind? We don't know. So I don't want to be too, forward-looking here and predicting that Donald Trump's going to win this thing. I don't think that's a fair, frankly, decision to make at this point. The rules are in his favor. The structure is in his favor. The calendar is in his favor. None of that guarantees anything for Donald Trump by any means, but it certainly is why a lot of people, again, are saying it seems like he's going to end up being the nominee of the party. So we'll see. We'll see how all this works out. And again, don't forget, when you add up all the delegates that are at stake at these contests, we've got a handful of delegates coming up this time around. Michigan has 55. South Carolina, that will be decided on Saturday, has 50. Idaho and Missouri both have 86 in total together. All of those delegates are going to be decided between now and March 5th. And 3 of those states are winner-take-all states, in effect, because they're hybrid states. So there's a big chunk of delegates that are going to go to one or the other of these 2 candidates fairly quickly in the next week or so. And then on March 5th, we've got 874 delegates at stake in those contests. Now, that's a pretty big number, but if you add these together, and I did the math the other day in my office, I'm not a good math person. I used to go up at the board at 2nd grade and cry when I had to do math on the board, so bear with me with this. But if you add these numbers up, none of them total the 1,215 that you need to get the nomination, even if you won all of them. And I don't think either candidate's going to win all of them, of course. Many of these are proportional states where one or the other is going to pick up delegates. Go on, though, with the next round in March 12th and March 19th, and you're talking about enough delegates at stake to essentially wrap this thing up, even if some of the delegates on March 5th are, again, proportionally given to both candidates. 350 are at stake on one day on March 19th, and 3 of the 5 states that I listed earlier that are holding their primaries on March 19th are winner-take-all primary states. So there's enough of a chunk of delegates that are going to, again, go to one candidate or the other on that day that's likely to put someone over the top with the number of delegates they need. So you can call me, email me, write me, whatever you want to do on March 19th and say, Dave, you were wrong. But my guess is by March 19th, this is done. One way or the other, it's done. Now, again, a lot of unpredictable things have been happening, right? I'll remind you that one of the things that was supposed to happen on March 4th, the day before Super Tuesday, was supposed to be the beginning of Donald Trump's federal trial that Jack Smith is bringing. Now that that's been delayed by the Supreme Court, that's not going to happen. But that event could have very easily shaped the headlines on March 5th as voters went to the polls. It could have been a big change in where the balance is. New York is advancing its case on the Stormy Daniels business and using campaign funds to pay off Stormy Daniels for her silence. That case is at least going to be in the news, I think, in the next week or two. So who knows where that might lead in all of this. And again, 2 weeks is a long time in politics. So anything can happen. So we're going to have to wait and see how things unfold between now and March 5th. And certainly, I think, again, March 5th isn't going to decide it for anyone, but it's certainly going to be important into allocating delegates. We'll see where the 2 candidates are at the end of that. Nikki Haley has said, I'm staying into it to the very end, so we'll see, in fact, if that happens. Right now, she's not doing too well in the polls in South Carolina. Now, this poll is about 2 weeks old at this point. It seems to be the only one anyone's reporting these days, and it shows her behind Donald Trump. Again, this is a proportional state, so she'll pick up delegates even if she doesn't end up doing much better than this. Her internal polling, at least her campaign has been saying, has been increasing in the last few days, so we'll see what happens. She raised a lot of money last week for her campaign. About $43 million apparently came in 1 week to her campaign. So that's a pretty good sign. There are a lot of Republicans out there who are still supporting her. I will say this, the canary in the cave, as they say, right? The canary they used to take down to see if there was poison gas. The canary in the cave in politics is donations. The minute the money starts drying up, the candidate's going to be dropping out. But so far that hasn't happened with Nikki Haley. In fact, the opposite has been happening. She's been raising more and more money as time goes on. So there are a lot of reasons to think she's going to be competitive in all this. And again, that's why I think it's really premature for people to be saying, line up behind Donald Trump because he's the inevitable nominee of this party. But we'll see. The other thing to know about South Carolina is that there's not a whole lot of wiggle room here for picking up votes. This was a poll that was done about 3 weeks ago. So again, this might have changed. It's the most recent one I could find. But it does seem as though the two candidates have a pretty firm backing with the voters that are out there, and not a lot of voters who are willing to change their mind on candidates. There's a fairly healthy percentage underneath, but not enough, I think, to make up the difference that we're seeing in the polls. So it is true that things are kind of locked in South Carolina, it seems. But again, it all depends on who shows up on Saturday, right? Polls don't mean anything, votes do. And we'll see what the turnout's like, and we'll see who's motivated to turn out to vote in the South Carolina primary. One other thing to mention in all this that I think is also important to be thinking about, and I'm going to end with this and open it up for your comments, but one thing to think about is the fact that already in the House of Representatives, 43 representatives have decided not to run for re-election this time around. That's a pretty big number, especially this early on in all of this. Over in the Senate, 7 senators have decided not to run for re-election in the Senate. Of those, 23 are Democrats, 20 are Republicans in the House, 5 are Democrats in the Senate, 2 are Republicans. Those are seats that may or may not be competitive this next time around in the congressional races in the fall. And, we unfortunately tend to focus only on the presidential election. We forget that all of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election this time, right? And it's just as consequential to where our politics is going. Right now in the House of Representatives, the Republicans have 219 Republicans, and 218 is a majority. It's a very, very narrow majority that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is hanging on to right now. And of course, he's terrified of losing votes. You lose even a handful of votes, even 3 or 4 votes in the House, and you've lost your majority if you're Mike Johnson. In the Senate, very, very close as well. 51 Democrats are the majority for Mitch McConnell. For Chuck Schumer in the Senate as Democratic leader. He can't afford to lose any Democrats in votes either. So it is very consequential that this number of Republicans and Democrats are choosing not to run for re-election the next time around, or this time around. It could very well swing the direction of the House and Senate on that alone. And even though most members, particularly in the House of Representatives, get reelected fairly easily for a variety of reasons, gerrymandering and raising money and so on, when you have seats that are opening up, and if those districts they're opening up in are competitive, and the number I've seen at least that people have been looking at this, say roughly 20 of them are this time around, then this election could swing the balance of the House very easily in one direction or the other, and perhaps even the Senate in one direction or the other. So there's a lot of consequence coming with these congressional races as well. One last thought, you think about the Electoral College and what ultimately does decide the presidency, right? Each state votes on election day. Whoever wins the most votes in at least 48 of the 50 states ends up with all the electors in that state. It's also going to be a state-by-state contest between these candidates. And if you look at the results in 2020, these are the results in some of the closest states in 2020. And if you look at those, they're incredibly close. This is why it took so long to settle the election in 2020. Arizona, by roughly 0.3% of the vote, Pennsylvania very close, Michigan, North Carolina. These are all states that have a large number of electors at stake, all of which were very close last time around. All but one of them, North Carolina, broke for Joe Biden. That's why Biden ended up winning with 303 elector votes. You need 270, he got 303. The reason I put the state names in red is because Donald Trump is now leading in polls in every single one of those states by at least 5%. That's what's got the Biden people worried. They've got to get their vote out. They've got to get voters to turn out, and they have to appeal to those voters in a way that's going to motivate them to at least match what they did in 2020, if not do better than what they did in 2020. And at least so far, that's been a struggle for the Biden campaign. That's their challenge in the next few months, is to really get that going and guarantee people will turn out to vote. Very same thing true for Donald Trump as well. He can't lose ground in any of these states, right? Even though he's ahead in the polls, we're a long way away from November. Again, 2 weeks is an eternity in politics, let alone several months is an eternity in politics. Who knows where all the trials are going to be and all the other legal issues are going to be for Donald Trump. There's a lot to happen between now and November. But the fact of the matter is, the Biden people can't be comfortable with this. And at least up until roughly a month ago, they seemed like they were just kind of waiting to get their campaign going. And this is why a lot of Democrats are starting to say, you can't do that. You've got to get going now. You've got to start motivating voters to participate, to turn out. You've got to get people excited about this campaign. So there are challenges, I think, for both parties looking ahead to November in the end. But, of course, the nomination is the first step. And as I say, I don't think it's a lock at this point for Donald Trump. I think a lot can happen in the next few months. He's got things in his favor, but we've got to wait and see what happens, I think, particularly on March 5th with the candidates and ultimately with all the other things that could be happening between now and then. Anyway, I've gone on longer than I intended to. I'm just curious about your thoughts. Anything that people would like to offer? Yeah, go right ahead.
I just have one question.
Sure.
A couple of questions. Like one thing. In Massachusetts, if you in the primary,
Yeah.
if you are an independent, it's not really an independent in Massachusetts. It's an unenrolled.
Right.
If you are that, you can choose which one.
Yes, that's correct. The question is, if you're an unenrolled or unaffiliated voter, can you participate in either primary? And the answer is yes. We're what's known as a semi-closed primary. I guess you could see it as semi-open too. It's kind of the, glass half empty or half full, right? We are, in essence, a closed primary state because you do have to be a Republican or Democratic voter, registered voter, in order to vote with that party. But if you are an unaffiliated voter, you can go in and ask for either party's ballot. So, what's that, sorry? Those are the only people who can do that, that's right. So we are, in essence, a closed, the people usually count us as a closed primary state, even though that's true. By the way, that's true for several other of these states, too, that I've listed as closed primary states. It is possible for unaffiliated voters to come in and vote in either of the parties' contests. The thing to keep in mind is those numbers are usually pretty low, as opposed to open primaries where anybody can walk in, including Democrats, and vote in the Republican caucus or primary. It's a very different story with an open primary state. So,
aren't in some of these states, like Georgia and I forget another, they've been ordered to change their maps?
They have. The question is, I'm repeating your question for the folks who are watching. Haven't states like Georgia been ordered to change their maps? Yeah, they're talking more about redistricting and gerrymandering around that, and they probably won't be in effect to affect the 2020 election for the most part. I think Georgia will be, but I think some of the other states, New York will be, that's right. But there are several other states that have court cases going on right now where they're less likely to be, yeah. Yes, go ahead, yeah.
It seems like an awful lot that's under in terms of primaries and caucuses, that is under the control of the party.
Yes.
But why is it that the states determine whether they're open or closed primaries?
Very good question, yeah. So
and
some.
Also the proportional hybrid and winner-take-all kind of.
Right. The question is, the parties seem to be in control of some of this, but the states also seem to be in control of some of it. And you're absolutely right. The schedule of primaries and caucuses is really a party decision. It's really the party that determines that. But how the state chooses to run its primary or caucus is up to the state. So it's the states that make those determinations, not the party. State law decides whether or not it's an open or closed primary. State law decides whether or not it's a hybrid, distribution of votes. It is, in essence, a state-run system. And the Constitution provides that. The Constitution essentially says the states will run their own elections in that way. So even though the party has got control over the schedule, the states have control over how they run their primaries and caucuses. You're absolutely right. It's a little of both. One of the reasons why New Hampshire wasn't too happy with the Democrats this time around, right? It was a Democratic Party decision that said, we are not going to have New Hampshire be the first primary, we're going to make it South Carolina. And of course, they did that to benefit Joe Biden, right? They knew Biden did well in South Carolina. They wanted that to be the big headline and the first boost in the campaign. But New Hampshire said, we don't care, we're going to have it anyway. And they went ahead and did it. And that struck a really interesting tone about who's really in control of all of this. Of course, Biden didn't compete in that. He wasn't on the ballot. People wrote his name in, and he ended up winning it anyway. But it was the party, the state, sort of asserting itself against the party control over the calendar in that way. They said, we get to decide what day we hold our primary. It's a state decision. We're going to exercise our right to hold our primary whenever we want to. What's that? Raspberries. Well, yeah, you could disagree with it, but that's another example of where states do have some say and some control over all this. Yeah, it's going to be sort of interesting, I think, in particular. Again, thinking of the legal calendar here as to when some of these cases are likely to happen. If the Supreme Court decides not to hear the appeal, the Trump appeal on the decision of the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, it's entirely possible that case may begin to go forward. It's not going to go forward as soon as March 5th. They're really talking about it going forward at the earliest towards the end of March at this point. If that does happen, it may very well be that Donald Trump has enough delegates to win the nomination when the convention meets. But the question is already coming up, what if something should happen that Donald Trump cannot be the candidate? What if he gets locked up? What if a trial takes place and he's in jail? It's opening up a lot of very interesting questions about what might happen in all this. The Democrats, of course, many of them uncertain about Biden as a candidate, uncertain about his appeal because of his age. There's talk about an open primary, open convention there as well. That's not going to happen, I don't think. It's the rules don't make that possible. But it could happen on the Republican side. And if so, it's an interesting question to ask yourself, what Republican would emerge as a candidate if not Donald Trump? Would they all turn to Nikki Haley? Would some other MAGA Republican from that side of that wing of the party advance themselves as a candidate? Would it be, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Ted Cruz or whoever? Who knows? But again, anything can happen this time around. I think we're in for a very, very interesting summer. If not an interesting March, a very interesting summer as all this starts to unfold. And as I say, it's a very unpredictable, I think, period that we're coming into with all of this. It should be a very interesting question as to how all this works out. The other question that someone raised to me the other day as I was talking about this is, what if Donald Trump doesn't get the nomination? And the last time that happened, that a sitting a president running for the nomination of his party after losing an election, hasn't happened for a long time. But one very unhappy former Republican president who didn't get the nomination was Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, the Republican Party chose Taft as their nominee when Teddy wanted to make a comeback and become the Republican candidate in 1912. What did he do? He walked out of the convention hall in New York City, gathered all his supporters around him, and announced he was forming a third party, the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party as it was officially known. And he split the Republican vote, made Woodrow Wilson president in 1912. Would Donald Trump, if he doesn't get the nomination, go off and form a third party, a MAGA party? Who knows? It's possible. And, I don't think Donald Trump will take it well if he doesn't become the nominee of the Republican Party. So there's that kind of speculation going on as well. So a lot of ifs, a lot of possibilities here, a lot of, as I say, twists and turns, I think, that are still to come in all this. It makes it very hard in some ways to predict this. But I go back to what I said earlier. This is a calendar and a set of rules and an arrangement of how delegates are allocated that are clearly going to benefit one candidate or the other very quickly as the front runner. I mean, that's the way it was set up. It was set up with the intention when the Republicans scheduled all this in 2020 to prepare the ground for Donald Trump coming back in 2024. The fact that Nikki Haley is still competitive is not something I think they were counting on. But the reality is, the way it's set up, it is designed to get someone the nomination fairly quickly in this process. And it is going to happen one way or the other, I think, in March. I don't think it's going to take much more past March 19th to do this. Yeah, go right ahead.
Can a political party arbitrarily decide how many delegates to send to a convention? And if yes, did either of these parties change? And if yes, why would they change?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can the parties change the number of delegates to a convention? And if so, did they, and why did they? That's basically the question, right? Yeah. They didn't change between 2020 and now. In fact, most of the recent conventions have been roughly this size for the Republicans. And the Democrats usually have bigger conventions. They usually have more like 3,000 and some delegates. The Republicans tend to have slightly smaller conventions when they meet. But it is up to them. And they have varied in the past. Some conventions have been much bigger than what we have now. Some have been smaller. I think in part it depends on the party itself, what it can manage, what it can organize. Part of it has been whether or not they think it's been representative of the party in the way in which the delegates have been allocated and ultimately making the decision about the candidates. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is the conventions really are not what they used to be. They're not opportunities for the parties to really make any big decisions. It used to be that you went to the convention not knowing who the nominee is going to be. We're going to know by the end of March who the nominee is going to be for the Republicans. It's not a cliffhanger. And since really George Bush Sr., when he announced Dan Quayle as his vice presidential nominee a month or so, I think it was 2 weeks before the Republican convention, we now already know who the vice presidential candidate is going to be. That used to be the big what's going to happen at the convention moment. We don't even have that anymore. So the conventions really do not provide any opportunity for any kind of really interesting contest going on at the convention. They're really rather dull affairs anymore. They're opportunities for speeches. Yeah.
Keying off of that,
Yeah.
other than the fact that people like to go to parties and
Right.
and drink and whatever, do you see political conventions just going by the wayside?
Well, there's a lot of talk about that, and I think the last time around, because of COVID, when the Democrats didn't hold a traditional convention, a lot of people started to ask the question, should we even bother anymore, right? Should we even bother to do this? Now they're going back to it this time. They are going to hold a traditional convention this time. But there's a lot of talk about changing the nature of conventions. The one thing that conventions still do, I think, is they do provide showcase opportunities for candidates. Bill Clinton was the showcase person who was at the 1988 Democratic Convention. He put in the nomination Mike Dukakis' name. And you might remember Bill's back there gesturing. He went on and on and on until 2 or 3 in the morning and took a lot of heat for it, but made his name in Democratic politics and was the nominee in 1992. Barack Obama introduced John Kerry at the 2004 Democratic Convention and gave a very great speech, very fiery speech, and was the nominee in 2008. And then in 2012, we had Clint Eastwood talking to a chair. But things happen at conventions. There are twists and turns. There are moments at conventions that are memorable, maybe for not the right reasons, but things do happen at conventions. But for the purpose of what conventions were meant to do, decide who the candidate's going to be, that hasn't been a contest for a very long time now. It's really decided much earlier, and everybody knows, as I say, by mid-spring. The only time when there's been any kind of drawn-out process, like in 2012, we might have to wait until May or June to know that. But we know it before the convention, no question about it. Conventions just don't have surprises in that way anymore. Question in the back. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
I've read in various news reports that that there's nothing in the Constitution or current law that says that, for example, Donald Trump is ineligible to be elected, sworn in, and serve as president in a jail cell. Is that true?
Can Donald Trump serve the president as president in a jail cell? Well, a lot of people are asking that question. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work for several reasons, not just the problem of security, but the functions of the presidency, right? Foreign travel, meeting with, people from, leaders of other countries and so on. It would make it impossible. So there is talk about, should something like that happen, would a sentence be delayed in its being carried out? That seems much more likely than a president sitting in a jail cell. It's almost a virtual impossibility also, at least the way things are going, that any legal decisions will put Donald Trump in that position between now and November. Again, had the federal trial started on March 5th, that could very well have happened. And he could have been convicted even before the conventions with the schedule that was anticipated for that trial. The longer that's delayed, the less likely it is something like that might happen. So I don't know if we'll ever face that question. It's a very interesting and difficult question, I think, to face. You know, what happens if someone is convicted of a crime in that way? We don't know, because we've never had this situation before. And at least as far as most presidential legal scholars, they're leaning on the side of you would have to delay the sentence, right, carrying out the sentence, rather than trying to put a president in prison and run the presidency from a jail cell. It just couldn't happen. It's going to be an interesting question about how you even imprison a former president, because they do have to have Secret Service protection. So you certainly can't put them in a traditional, prison. They're not going to get locked up, in the way a traditional prisoner would be locked up. So there's also that question that we might have to wrestle with. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon before we ever got to that point with Nixon, right? But it looked like it was heading in that direction. But I don't think that's likely to happen with Donald Trump. Bill, I think your last question. Yeah, we're almost out of time.
Well, I'm reminded of the fact that Harry Truman said that the White House was the crown jewel.
Yeah, the prison system. Yeah, that's right.
I actually have a question going back to the delegate distribution
Yeah.
and primaries. The states get a number of delegates based on how many electoral college votes they have, but also they take into account, they reward states that they carried and they punish states
Right.
that did not. And I'm wondering to what extent that's contributing to the parties moving to the extremes.
Yeah,
Because the states that Democrats carry generally are more progressive. There's not as much space for more moderate Democrats in other parts of the country
Right.
to have their voice.
right. Again, let me repeat the question sort of in a short form for folks listening at home. The way in which the parties allocate delegates, the question is, the fact that the parties seem to have more and more extreme elements, is that making the allocation of delegates more and more problematic, fair to say, for the parties? Is that sort of where you were going with that, Bill?
Well, they're rewarding states.
They're rewarding
that carry in
states,
the
right,
election. They
yeah.
tend to be more progressive
Right,
states.
right.
There are a lot of Democrats in red states.
Right.
Who end up having fewer delegates representing them at the
Right,
convention.
right. Well, the way they do it is actually a very complicated formula. They do it in part based, as you're saying, on the elector vote, on the results, but they actually use the results from several elections to decide it. So it's not based on just the most recent election. It's actually based on a sort of historical tradition of how well that state has supported the party in the past. And I can't even begin to tell you some of the other things they take into account, but it's a very complicated formula they use. When I described this in my class, I used to put a formula up, a mathematical formula for something like the, eclipse of the sun or something, and the students would go, "Is that really the formula, Dr. Smailes?" I'd say, no. I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that it's a very complicated formula they use. So, yeah, to answer your question, it is true that those things influence the allocation of delegates, but there are a lot of other things that influence it as well. It's not just solely that. And each time the party does this, they make adjustments based on the last election, but that's not the sole determining factor to decide how many delegates a state gets from in a particular election. Folks, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I hate to stop because I always enjoy talking politics, but I really appreciate you all coming out tonight, and I thank you. And I will just end with a commercial that I always end with the classes with. Go vote on March 5th, please. Make sure you participate. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There are also state conventions.
Yes.